Talk tonight. James Manicom will be speaking to us tonight on Japan-China maritime relations. James he's a research fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation in Waterloo in Canada. My name is Matt. I'm a professor here, so I'll be moderating the discussion. I think what we usually do, Robert is away. For those of you who were expecting Robert, he's away right now, so I'm replacing him. I think James will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, okay? And then we'll have question time until about 8:45 or so, okay? And I won't take up any more. Sure, all yours. Okay. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming. I know everyone's very busy, so I really appreciate you taking the time to come and hear me talk. I'm going to talk to you today about my book, Bridging Troubled Waters, China, Japan, and Maritime Border in East Asia. A lot of people think I'm nuts because I'm actually optimistic for the China-Japan maritime relationship. Nobody believes me, but I'm going to try to convince you anyway. But what you do have to do is lower your expectations and redefine what you think you understand about cooperation. Well, I think the story of the East China Sea is actually a story of cooperation. At least that's how I tell it. It's not a story about war, because it hasn't been a war in the East China Sea. It's not a story about conflict, because it hasn't been conflict. It's a story about confrontation. It's a story about brinksmanship. But at the end of the day, it's also a story of dispute management. And as an academic, I have to define things before I can talk about them. So, cooperation is any instance where you adjust your preferences to accommodate those of your other, the rival, who you're trying to cooperate with. And if you define cooperation that way, you actually do have concrete examples of China and Japan trying to get along in the East China Sea. So that's the first point. Maritime issues in between China and Japan, I argue, are a function of two things, or two trends, if you like. One of them is the existence of disputed sovereignty claims in maritime zones, right? The sovereignty claims over Senkaku, Diaoyu, obviously go back a century or so, if not more. Those exist. Actually, as a function of the law of the sea that came into effect in 1994, the issue becomes more complicated because now you have maritime zones that may or may not come from the islands themselves, but also from the coastlines. Right? So now you've got the whole East China Sea area that's under dispute. The other trend is China's rise. I'm not blaming China for rising. China's China. It's allowed to grow. It's allowed to have a navy. It's allowed to do things with that navy. But certainly China's rise has occasioned a lot of the tensions that you see in the region, not deliberately most of the time. But the fact is that China is more active than ever in Japanese waters. And the fact is that over the past 20 years or so, Japan has had to react to that in a variety of different ways to accommodate changing Chinese behavior. I am going to apportion some blame in this talk. I'm going to blame China. I'm going to blame Japan for, at different points, failing to take the initiative or for failing to actually follow through on a few things. But those two trends, the law of the sea and China's rise, are sort of trends that form the backdrop to the China-Japan maritime relationship. What I'll do is I'll talk about where we are. In the book, I talk about 5 cases of cooperation where they've adjusted their preferences to accommodate those of their other. And I'll tell you sort of where we are with those. Some of them are ongoing, some of them are pretty fleeting, some of them are dead. And it's not a good time to be talking about cooperation in the China-Japan relationship. But then I'll sort of set out why I am optimistic, based on what I've observed over the course of their behavior the last 30 years with regard to the dispute. And I'll conclude with the best that you can hope for is a very informal, very flimsy, very tacit effort at dispute avoidance, conflict avoidance. That's not great. That's not the European Union model. That's not the Western model of preferring a formal, institutionalized, robust settlement, perhaps. I just don't see that happening. But I am optimistic that China and Japan can avoid conflict. Because remember, there are a couple of enduring, strategic level drivers or factors that do prevent conflict. And in the book, I don't engage critically with the U.S. Role in the region. I assume the United States will remain the hegemonic power or a strong power in the region. And I assume the United States will back Japan if and when that day comes. When I tell people in the US government that, some of them laugh at me, which they don't settling. But I actually do think the United States would back Japan if and when the war came, if not just to keep NATO together and the rest of the US security guarantees. If you don't back Japan, no other US ally would, aside from perhaps Canada, because we have geography on our side, would actually believe the US attorney. You'd have a real unraveling of the international system. The other fact of the matter is that China and Japan have far too much to lose economically from the conflict, and we've seen that after 2012. You saw Japanese investment start to pull out of China, and that affects Chinese jobs. And the Communist Party of China is about a couple of things, and one of those things is about jobs, right? It's about buying off the Chinese populace to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power. That's the wrong button. I screwed that up. So here we are in 2014. Here's our 5 cases of cooperation. The first 2 here shelve the dispute and ignore nationalists related to the islands themselves. Despite what Japanese political leaders may have said in the last 18 months or so, there was an agreement to shelve the dispute. Both sides recognized it, both sides knew what it meant. At various points in the relationship, elected leaders framed their actions in the context of shelving the dispute, only to be later corrected by MOFA. And it's clear that the Japanese never wanted shelving the dispute to be a formal, explicit arrangement. But there's no doubt that that occurred. However, that is dead as of 2012, right? When the Japanese government said explicitly, we never agreed to that. Well, obviously you're not going to shelve anything after that, right? Ignore nationalists. This was first identified by a scholar named Chung Peng Chung, who's, I think he's in Macau now, in a really great book about Chinese domestic politics and maritime disputes. And what he observes is that after 1996, in 1996 there's a crisis over the islands surrounding, it's driven by nationalists. Japanese nationalists at the islands, Chinese nationalists at the islands, the lighthouses constructed, all kinds of stuff. But what this scholar does observe is after that, there's a whole host of efforts to try to avoid being provoked by nationalists. Ishinori Shingo, who's a nationalist Japanese politician, promises to visit the islands in 1996 as part of the election. It's an election promise. In 1997 he goes. He visits he lands on Uratsuya. And the Chinese reaction was to say, we recognize that this man does not represent the Japanese government. Could you imagine China saying that now? This action does not represent the action of the Japanese government? That would have been a helpful attitude in September of 2012, right? So things have changed. So that's the first example. And there are others. In 2004, Chinese nationalists land on the islands, Koizumi sends them packing. Again, right? Avoiding provocations by nationalists, not wanting the relationship to get undermined by people that have that in their interest. Obviously, in 2012, the bid to purchase the islands was hard to handle. And it was obviously impossible for the Japanese government to ignore the effort because it would have succeeded. And as a function of that, you could argue that that would have been the end of that particular arrangement. But it still actually happens in a lot of ways, right? Just last week or 2 weeks ago, a gentleman in a balloon tried to land on Senkaku, right? That was pretty well handled, right? Prior to the 2012 nationalization in August, remember there was all the talk about whether they were going to buy the islands or not. A bunch of Chinese nationalists tried to sail the islands, and they returned back, and that was well handled, right? So this still happens from time to time. It's pretty fragile, but it is ultimately China that is most responsible for how that goes about, because it is China that argues that it is beholden to nationalist groups, that it can't control these nationalist groups. Yeah, it does a pretty good job of doing it when it wants to. There was a surprising lack of protest, for instance, in Chinese streets after Prime Minister Abe visited the Yasukuni Shrine on Boxing Day, right? That caught me off guard, because after 2012, I was expecting anarchy. So clearly China has some control over that. The fisheries agreement still mostly works most of the time, as long as Japan sends Chinese fishermen back that are arrested without too much trouble. So that still works most of the time. The notification agreement was reached in 2001 as part of an effort to create some rules around what research ships could and couldn't do in the waters of concern to the other. Regrettably, China started to break that right away. As the ships did not notify Japan, or if they did notify Japan they were coming, they would go to waters that they hadn't said they were going to go to. So that's dead, and that's China's fault. Here's our resources development agreement, right, which was concluded in 2008. I was really initially quite optimistic about this agreement because it was pretty well institutionalized, it was pretty well thought out. It seemed to address everyone's concerns. I blame Japan for that one falling apart, even though now it's the Chinese that said they won't talk about it. Because I think the Japanese government got a little cheeky with the interpretation of the agreement. Probably because at the time it wasn't clear what Japan was claiming in the East China Sea. Was it claiming to the median line? Was it claiming 200 nautical miles? When I spoke here in 2011, I took a straw poll of the audience, and most of the audience thought that Japan claimed to the median line. But in fact, Japan claimed farther, at 200 nautical miles. As a function of claiming at 200 nautical miles, what that does is it creates a pretext for Japan to claim sovereignty over the Chunshao gas field itself. Of course, the agreement says the Japanese oil companies will drill out the Chunshao gas field under Chinese law. We basically conceded sovereignty over a gas field. You can have such a thing if you're operating under Chinese law. So I blame Japan for that one. But here's where we are. It's not a pretty picture, yet I'm still optimistic. I'm optimistic for these reasons. Here are the central findings of the book. There's some of them remarkable, but I think I'm going to return to this at the end because these do provide an argument as to why I think we can actually still cooperate. The first thing is that cooperation follows crisis. At each point, different crisis points in the maritime relationship. 1978, when a bunch of Chinese fishermen turn up off the island with signs claiming sovereignty. 1990, when a nationalist built a lighthouse on one of the islands. 1996, when I mentioned about more nationalists building more lighthouses on islands. 2004, when the Chinese nationalists landed. Right, cooperation follows those crises. At each one of those points, Chinese and Japanese leaders reiterated whatever the cooperative mechanism was at the table. We accept it. You know, we don't want this to undermine our relationship. And actually, in many cases, created actually improved, I suppose, their mechanisms for getting along. Even after 2010, in October 2010, there was an important meeting between defense ministers in Hanoi about improving the maritime defense interactions, even at that low point, right? So cooperation follows crisis. The second point's sort of counterintuitive, which is that Japan has actually coerced China to cooperate. This happened a couple of times. In 2008, when the resources agreement was finally concluded, that came after a Japanese threat to drill in 2005, and a concerted effort by the Japanese government to make that threat credible. The Japanese government promised to subsidize Japanese oil companies that drilled in East China Sea. It bought the Ramcorn Victory that it had originally rented from Norway to do the surveys. And I argue that faced with that credible Japanese threat to drill, China agreed to the resources agreement, which actually is pretty favorable to Japan. Right? Japanese companies got access to the Chunshao gas field, and the joint development zone that was concluded actually straddles the median line, so it's far from Japanese shores in a pretty prospective area. So Japan has coerced China to cooperate in the past. The third point is that China cooperates to protect new gains of a status quo. So one of the reasons China cooperated in 2008 was because it had managed to create an environment where it was able to get away with resources development, and Japan couldn't get away with it unilaterally. Right? After 2008, by virtue of the agreement, any Japanese drilling that's going to happen, it has to happen with China in the joint development zone or near Chunshao. And fourth and finally, China and Japan have repeatedly shown themselves capable of managing differences informally. All of these agreements have been pretty informal, with the exception of the fisheries, right, which is an actual treaty. But all the rest have either been notes verbal, which is what the notification agreement was, an agreement that was translated somewhat differently in the resources case, and just simple understandings in the case of shelving the agreement and ignoring nationalists. Otherwise, on very little other than just political signature. So I'm going to talk real quickly about what's happening in China and Japan right now, and where this takes us into the future. In Japan, I think we're seeing a country that is prepared to stand up to China. But I've been watching this issue for about a decade, and it's funny, if it's hard to imagine Japan saying and writing, Japanese leaders and Japanese policymakers and Japanese think tank specialists, writing and thinking the things they're saying now about China in, say, 2002, 2003. Japan has come a long way on perceiving its maritime space as something that is under threat and as linking China to that threat. In 2004, it was a big deal when Japan observed that China's military spending was going up, which was a concern. Right now, you've got very frank, very concerned expressions of China, about China in Japanese white papers and in its publications itself. Right, you've got Japanese think tanks writing about the China shock in 2010. Right, they added that the discourse on China has changed in Japan, and this is matched by efforts in Japan to better utilize Japanese maritime space. Revising the mining law is one of those things. Changing the rules associated with Coast Guard, what the Coast Guard can and can't do to enforce Japan's maritime space. These are all efforts undertaken by the Japanese government since about 2007 to strengthen Japan's ability to control and enforce its maritime space. The salient law, there's the Basic Ocean Law and the subsequent Basic Ocean Plan. There's been 2 iterations of that. All that is about using Japan's maritime space. If you read the plan, it says other countries are using our space without our permission, and we have to stop it. Right? So that tells us the direction that Japan is going. It's not new. This is not a post-2012 thing. It's not a post-2010 thing. This has been going on for over a decade. This is the Shoyo, a Japanese Coast Guard vessel. There's a couple of confrontations that have happened with the Shoyo that illustrate this. In the spring of 2010, the Shoyo was confronted by 2 Chinese maritime surveillance vessels, as they were then known. It was doing marine scientific research in a disputed area of the East China Sea. And the CMS ships turned up and said, "Hey, Shoyo, you have to leave. You can't do this. You're in Chinese waters." And the Shoyo turned around and left. Now, in September, around the same time as the collision, actually near the islands, the Shoyo was again conducting similar activities in a similar area of the water. And the CMS ships came up again and said, "Hey, Shoyo, you can't be here. You're in Chinese waters. You have to leave." And the Shoyo said, "No, we don't. We're in Japanese waters, and we're going to finish what we're doing." And they did. I put that to the Coast Guard, and they said, "Yeah, we realized that we actually can't just back down. We can't do that." And we see that every day in the territorial sea around the islands. What's happening in China? China's interesting. China outwardly seems more confident, and you read the newspaper about renewed Chinese assertiveness and renewed Chinese confidence. I don't see either of those things as being driven by confidence. The way an angry 15-year-old isn't confident. Right? There's something else going on there, and China's in a position like that right now. The Chinese Communist Party, as you're probably aware, has a tenuous grasp, if you like, on its legitimacy. Right? Ultimately, it's about buying off the Chinese people and with promises of wealth and/or promises of protection against demons like Japan. Right? And we know that territorial issues with Japan attract national sentiment. I don't understand, I'm not sure anybody does, just how organic, if you like, that national sentiment is. Is it that Chinese people are born with and raised with an inherent sense of anti-Japanese sentiment because they remember the war, they've experienced the war, and they're told of Japanese atrocities? Or is it because the Chinese government has put this in their history textbooks? I think it's probably a bit of both, but there's no doubt that Beijing is able to use this as a bargaining tactic. They can say our hands are tied. We can't cooperate with Japan because it'll be unpopular domestically. It's a very democratic thought for an authoritarian country. Resource interests are also still important to China. The resources question has sort of fallen off the headlines, but it really shouldn't. In July 2013, CNOOC opened new blocks near the median line, and Japan protested. And this is one of them. The resources issue is still very active. It's not what gets the headlines right now because there's so many other things getting headlines, like air defense zones and confrontations between Coast Guard vessels and balloon towing nationalists. But this issue is still very current, and China does retain an interest in resources. I'll tell you later on that Japan doesn't. But for China, East China Sea gas makes sense. It makes sense for Sino, which is competing with PetroChina for a share of the gas market in Shanghai. And East China Sea gas is cheaper than gas piped across China in the West East Pipeline. Okay, so the gas is still a salient issue, at least for China. I'll do 2 slides now on what each country's interests are. It's difficult to sort of classify things as priority interests or secondary interests, but this is just my assessment, and if you disagree, I'd love to hear it in the Q&A. Here's what Japan's interests are. These are common to both. Right? Both countries want to exercise their claim jurisdiction in the area that they think is important, which of course overlaps. Also, both countries want to maintain their claim to the islands as best they can. Why do they want to do this? Probably because the islands have domestic political relevance. I think in Japan, that's a function of standing up to China. I think there was a time the Japanese people would have happily seen the Senkakus go to China in a fair way, but I think that moment is past. This is about standing up to China now. It's not an islands question, it's not a nationalist question, it's a China question. And it's also important, as I mentioned, that Japan is now aware of how important it is to exercise your maritime jurisdiction. You have to act like you own the place, right? And that's the Shoyo did in 2010, right? But equally important for Japan now is making the waters around Japan safer. And right now they're not safe, right? What didn't make the headlines in 2010 and 2011 were a series of confrontations between Chinese helicopters and Japanese ships, Japanese helicopters and Chinese ships. There are no protocols or interaction between navies and coast guards between China and Japan. They've actually had a number of efforts to try to create those kinds of things, and they've, I think, shown a great deal of leadership on both sides by having agencies from all across government present at those meetings. They have tried that, but it isn't sticking because of the political context. But certainly for Japan, as I said, there's nothing Japan can do about China's rise. Right? Japan cannot prevent China's rise. China's rise is probably in Japanese corporate interest in the long term, and Japan can't do anything about the Chinese Navy ships that drive around the Japanese islands because they're allowed to go there. Right? They're allowed to go through high seas. Right? But certainly, when you get Chinese ships that radar lock on Japanese ships, that is irresponsible. By any measure of naval conduct, that is irresponsible. And so a priority interest for Japan is making that maritime environment around Japan safer by getting along with the Chinese Navy, right? And I would argue that resource interests in trying to forestall China's rise are secondary. Japan can't do anything about trying to prevent China's rise, and the resources in the East China Sea don't matter to Japan. At the end of the day, Japan can't get East China Sea gas to Japanese shores because of the Okinawa Trough. You can't liquefy it at sea, it costs too much. Cheaper to get it from Australia, right? Even post-Fukushima, Japan will consume more natural gas than ever, more natural gas than anybody else, but it won't be East China Sea natural gas. On the Chinese side, it's a similar picture with a few differences. Right? Obviously, for obvious domestic reasons, China wants to claim that it controls Diaoyu. Right? China wants to exercise its claim jurisdiction in its claim space. That's not unique to East China Sea. Right? You see that in the South China Sea, you see it in the Yellow Sea. Right? But I would argue that resource development is more important to China than it is to Japan. Right? That's a function of what I was talking about earlier. Right? There's a corporate interest in China, a potentially very influential interest in the oil and gas sector. And although the resources in the East China Sea are not considerable, they're not earth-shattering, they're not going to change China's energy equation. Chinese consumption is such that any gas is good gas. Right? And East China Sea gas, as I mentioned, is cheaper than the stuff you get from Central Asia right now. Right? I don't think that I think that China's prepared to concede on its behavior at sea. I think China wants to be seen as a responsible naval power. I think that China recognizes that it's dangerous to have ships driving around the ocean and target other ships. I mean, the radar lock incident that happened in January was unsettling for a couple of reasons. If it's deliberate, that's terrifying. You've got reckless captains or reckless political leaders in Beijing. If it's accidental, that's terrifying, because you have incompetent Chinese Navy captains, right? And there are questions about the competence of some Chinese military assets, right? If you ask American pilots involved in the EP3 incident in 2001, they will tell you that the pilot that collided with the EP3 was known to them. He was nicknamed Maverick, and he had done that 1,000 times before, right? Does he have a little brother in the Navy? Who knows? But that's a concern. I also think that although heard a rumor that there's now a consensus in Beijing they're going to confront Japan on all points. I think that China, this is a domestic question, that Japan and China can ultimately get along in the things that matter, like the economy, like currencies, in many areas where they actually have a common interest in the environment and another one. Right? So the reason I outline those interests is to propose this trade-off. And this is sort of the whimper with which the book ends, because it is very hard to talk about strong, robust cooperation between China and Japan. But I simply propose a trade-off. You've got resources that Japan can't use, and in a very dangerous maritime environment that Japan and China want to make safer. So what if we set up some kind of arrangement where, without any effect, and without the legal language would be without prejudicing either side's claims, you have an environment where Japan stops making East China Sea resource development a political issue. Just let it happen. Not without prejudicing Japan's claims. Right? Japan makes East China Sea resource development easier. And there's no doubt that resource development from Beijing has been slow because of the political relationship with Japan. It has been slowed significantly by the fact that China will from time to time stop production, stop development as a function of Japanese concerns. It does happen. In exchange for that, what Japan and China could do is arrive at a series of rules and protocols that govern safe conduct at sea. These would again be notwithstanding the legalities of the issue. I'm talking about an agreed marine corridor. Right? Chinese strategists lament the fact that the Japanese islands are between China and the Pacific. We'll agree on a place that it is acceptable and permissible, and it is not suspicious and not provocative for the Chinese Navy to truck on through to get to the Pacific. Right? That reduces the pretext for Japan to get up real close and watch them the way it has. And if China deviated from this path, then you might know something's up. You could also have an environment where you basically adopt a model from the fisheries agreement, where you employ what's called flag state authority. Right? In the middle of the East China Sea, under the fisheries agreement, there's a thing called the provisional measure zone, and in that zone, countries don't police the activities of other countries. So Japanese ships, if they see a Chinese ship engaging in illegal fishing within this zone, they don't go and arrest the fishermen. They call the Chinese Coast Guard. You can have a similar thing involved in the exercise of military and Coast Guard jurisdiction in the East China Sea. Right? Ultimately, it doesn't matter who is allowed to police the jurisdiction as long as the jurisdiction is policed. Right? So what you get here is a trade-off. You trade resources Japan can't use for a more stable maritime relationship with China. There are a number of challenges associated with this. Not least is, as I mentioned earlier, just how competent is the Chinese Navy? Is the Chinese Navy capable of this? Is the Chinese Coast Guard capable of this? But that's just a pretext for close interaction anyway. Right? There's no, the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Coast Guard are the most professional of each in the region. Obviously, it's a face-saving question for the Chinese as to whether they're going to take any kind of lesson for the Japanese, but you can multilateralize that and get that done pretty quickly. So why can we expect this? Right? Let's go back to our findings. Right? We've had a crisis for the last year and a half. We've been in crisis mode. And the track record for China and Japan is that cooperation follows crisis. So there's one, at least experience, that suggests this is something that's feasible. This is on the minds of political leaders. They want to build confidence. They want to reduce the likelihood of a crisis. Right? Japan coerces China with a stronger stance. Right? We're seeing Japan, under Prime Minister Abe, adopt what I would describe as a far more assertive stance towards China. A far more coercive stance. Japan is prepared to stand its ground. Japan is increasing its defense budget for the first time in a decade. Right? These are things the Chinese government interprets as coercion. They interpret this as Japan standing its ground. Right? And all the literature on Chinese security tells us that China responds to strength. It doesn't respond to weakness. We know China cooperates to consolidate gains. China has made gains over the last 18 months. Right? In the territorial sea around the Senkaku Islands, Chinese Coast Guard is there almost every day now. They police those waters the way the Japanese do. And they, of course, notify the Japanese, hey, you have to leave Chinese waters. The Japanese say, no, you have to leave Japanese waters. As long as nobody's shooting at each other, they can do that forever. It is interesting that they've had that interaction almost every day for 18 months, and there hasn't been an accident. It makes you wonder, perhaps they've arrived at some kind of protocol for getting along. The differences are often handled informally, which is what I suspect is happening in the territorial sea of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands right now. Now there are some implications here, right? Japan, if you're going to accept this new status quo, and Japanese officials have told me they will not accept the new status quo, but they have in a de facto sense for the last 18 months. Japan is going to have to accept intrusions into the territorial sea, the way it does right now. It's not new, right? But this time, as a function of this trade-off, it will have actual rules of engagement. It will have protocols established with the Chinese Coast Guard, established with the Chinese Navy. It doesn't already in the context of the territorial sea. That'll make those interactions safer. Unwelcome, but safer. China, as I mentioned, will need to improve the professionalism of its navies and its Coast Guard in order to make this kind of thing sustainable. Most of the work that you read from Japanese strategists, from NIDS and elsewhere, is suspicious of China's very interest in the idea of confidence building. They view it as a political step rather than an actual effort to reduce tensions. But be that as it may, the Chinese political apparatus, I think, recognizes that we've come to a point now where it's getting very dangerous in the East China Sea, and they'll begin to look for ways out. This is, as I said, this is not a solution. This is a trade-off. It'll be informal, it'll be flimsy, but I think it'll work because at the end of the day, the basic parameters of this conflict haven't changed. You've still got a China that is rising, that is weaker than Japan and the United States combined. You've got the United States that will back Japan, and you've still got an economic relationship that works and that is proper for both. Anyway, the last slide talks about why we can accept this. What's the objective? And I have a picture of the aid is. I thought that was something that was handled particularly poorly by both sides. But what we're talking about here is a set of rules and norms. This is not formal cooperation. This is not territorial settlement. I think that's just too much to ask. I don't think either Beijing or Tokyo is capable of exercising the kind of political leadership that is necessary to settle this issue. So if that's not going to happen, you have to make do with what you've got. And what we got here is a track record of very loose, very tacit, flimsy cooperation between two countries that understand and ultimately have to get along. Right? Japanese foreign administration people sometimes say, we can't move. We're stuck next to China. And I think it's a very mature attitude because it suggests that Japan is aware of what it needs to do to get along with China. I do think, though, that it's fair that Japan has probably done just about enough to try to get along. And that it is appropriate for Japan to make the kinds of changes that Abe has proposed, if only to coerce China or to stand up strong against China, which, as I've said here, has actually been conducive to cooperation in the past. This isn't about reconciliation. It's not about trying to fix and solve the problems of war that happened 60 years ago. China hasn't been terribly forthcoming as to what reconciliation means to China. I don't think the Chinese government wants to reconcile. It's not about adjudication. It's not about the International Court of Justice. China's not a member. Japan would probably, I think, let it go if China proposed it, but that's not going to happen because China's not a member. It's not negotiation. Neither country wants third-party intervention. The foreign minister of my country has proposed that. I think a little far-fetched. This is informal. It's fragile. It's a first step. But I think ultimately it's the best we can hope for. So I'll leave it there, and we can start the Q&A and conversation.
Great. Thank you very much, James. Okay, so James has essentially provided an argument. Conventional wisdom is that conflict is inevitable, or the risk of conflict over the dispute between Japan and China is high. So James has provided a counter-argument that in fact he's quite optimistic about it, and that his grounds for optimism based on essentially historical precedent. There has been no conflict, and there is a framework of norms developing over time, and that hopefully Japan and China, over time, these norms perhaps become codified in some way, or at least become stronger. So again, very interesting argument, and goes against a lot of the conventional wisdom. So now we have some time for Q&A. We'll try to go to about 8:45 or so, if that's okay. So if you could, when you get the mic, please, if you could just identify yourself, your name and your affiliation, and then please provide a very, how should we say it, simple question for James that's answerable, just so that everybody will have an opportunity to speak. Okay? Thank you. So, yeah. Okay, I'll use this.
My name is Sandal, small business owner, and my question is always why you haven't mentioned any word about America. Japanese can't get used to them. In other words, America, do you think, is not playing no rule about this, and it is still accomplishment.
I'm sorry, could you say the last part again? America is...
Without America, this is still the idea that you explained.
No, my argument relies on America, as does Japanese security. And as I said, I buy American resolve. I buy the pivot. I buy the rebalancing. I think that the United States is prepared to lead Germany and double down on the Asia Pacific. I think that should be clear. So I do think, and as a function of that, honoring the defense commitment to Japan and fighting China over the Senkaku Islands is part of that. Nobody wants that, but I think that American political leaders understand that. Obviously, it's not something we want to advertise because in the past there has been concerns about emboldening Japan, and Japan does not need emboldening right now. So I think you'll see America be diplomatic about it. But I also don't buy the argument that America will abandon Japan for improved relations with China. America doesn't need to abandon Japan to have improved relations with China. And there is also no other issue in between China and America that is affected by the Japan-China relationship. America and China have other problems on Iran and on all kinds of things, climate, but it's not clear to me that any trade-off on Japan and China will affect that issue. So I think that America's resolve, America's commitment to Japan is secure. Not everyone agreed.
Next question? Okay, gentlemen, please pass the mic.
Dan Slater from the Delphi Network. Great talk, thanks very much. I think the point about portioning blame is really interesting. I was wondering, looking back now to 2012 and the arrest of the sea captain by the defense ministry, and when Maihara was there, slightly surprising DPJ, you think that they would be sort of slightly more mellow. The Ishihara's initiative for buying the islands, the nationalization of the islands, the ongoing argument by the Japanese that there is no dispute, which seems to fly in the face of reality. I was wondering whether you could comment on those aspects.
Sure. I think, well, the first thing is, I wasn't surprised the DPJ reacted the way it was, because when the DPJ was in opposition, they actually proposed a number of initiatives that were quite strong on China. A lot of the one of the laws that was passed in 2007 was about the safety of structures at sea, basically protecting oil installations from interference. That was the DPJ that really drafted that. So the DPJ, I think there's been a sort of consensus on China, at least in the maritime realm, the DPJ and LDP for a decade or so. I'm no expert on Japanese domestic politics. The no dispute thing is interesting because, that's been Japanese policy forever, and Japan never really had to explain it to anyone until the world's attention focused on this issue. And there's a really great Swedish scholar by the name of Linus Hagström that wrote a book about this. And he argues that that by denying the dispute in the 90s, what Japan did was it basically denied the legitimacy of China's reactions to these little crises that would happen. And it gave both countries a way out. Because Japan could say, well, you can blather on with sounds all you want, there is no dispute. And the Chinese at the time didn't have an incentive to make a big deal out of it, because they were too busy trying to go to Japan anyway. And the other side wanted to escalate. In the dispute, so the denying the dispute is a holdover of a policy that's 30 years old. It's hard for the Japanese government to explain it now because it's being subject to so much criticism. But that's the background. I mean, it's a very real policy. And the problem is that to change that policy amounts to a political concession to China. So if someone says, well, I can't understand why Japan doesn't just change the policy and agree to negotiate, that in itself is a concession. And that's not to say that Japan wouldn't make that concession, but when you make a concession, you want something in return. So what does it get in return? So that's the background.
Next question. Here.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I must confess that I may have missed several sentences from your presentation. I hope my question will be relevant. My name is Takao Takahara. I teach international politics and peace studies at Meiji Gakuin University. What is your assessment on the current situation where we have a very problematic government administration? So the leaders do not meet, and it seems that the distrust on the part of China against Japan is mounting to a worrisome degree. Isn't there a very, how should I put it, I don't know how to put it in English, the situation where you have the barrel and the matches are around? So don't you have any fear of something happening?
I certainly do. And one of the projects that we're doing in my think tank is a project about trust and empathy, which comes up more and more nowadays. You read it in the news. Peter Rockman said something about the effect that neither China or Japan can put themselves in the shoes of the other, and that's an enormous problem. But my argument is that you don't need to have trust to avoid conflict. You need to have trust to have reconciliation. But I don't see reconciliation. All I see is a perpetuation of this awful, tense, crisis-prone relationship, but that when it is well managed. I also don't think that China distrusts Japan more than ever. I think they've never trusted Japan. I think if anyone trusts anybody less, it's Japan trusts China less, which is disappointing.
Elaine Kirkabach with the Associated Press. Thanks for your remarks. I'm wondering if you see any potential for transferring this model that you suggest to the other disputes that China has in the South China Sea, in which China seems to claim all the way down, basically, as far as it goes. And also, say, Japan's situation with South Korea, which is obviously less alarming, but also
I don't think my model is transferable because a big part of my argument is that there is a long track record of conflict avoidance between China and Japan. One of the really interesting things with the fisheries arrangement is that Chinese and Japanese fisheries have been managed since before there was diplomatic relations between the two countries. I mean, they've got a fisheries management relationship that goes back to 1955, which was before China recognized Japan and Japan recognized China. And it was a non-governmental agreement. It was between professional fisheries agencies. So these are two countries that know how to get along. By contrast, I don't think that China has the kind of institutionalized relationship with Japan. It's interesting to use the phrase institutionalized relationship because ties between two countries are so brittle. But China doesn't have this kind of relationship with Vietnam or the Philippines or Malaysia. So I don't think this model is transferable. The second part of your question related to Korea. I've had a very limited exposure to Japanese and Korean professionals when they interact, but the limited exposure I have had is that they get along pretty well. And I guess I suspect that Japan and Korea tensions are a political phenomenon, they're a popular phenomenon, and that ultimately, if the political leaders don't get it, I think the bureaucrats do. There are a lot of areas where Japan and Korea cooperate very well. And what's interesting is a good way to gauge mistrust is what's the initial set of interactions on a new issue. And one of my other hats is an Arctic scholar. And I looked at East Asian countries in the Arctic Council. And what I found was that Japanese and Koreans were far more predisposed to talk to each other than they were to China about Arctic issues. So that speaks to trust right off the bat. So I think that's a relationship that it's in a much better state, obviously, than the China-Japan relationship.
Paul Midford, Norwegian University for Science and Technology. Very interesting talk. 2 points. One, this is part of my inference from your talk and also some of your earlier work, but you seem to be arguing, if I'm not mistaken, that Japan has in some sense been socialized by China's kind of aggressive maritime tactics to become more aggressive and stand its own ground. But a kind of similar and partially overlapping hypothesis would be that Japan is in some sense becoming more insecure because of its relative decline in power, and therefore, I mean, we often talk about, you know, how China is becoming supposedly more aggressive as it rises, its relative power increases, but you could actually make the same inference about a declining power and that Japan wants to kind of consolidate its control over the Senkakus and other maritime areas while it thinks it still has relative power advantage versus waiting into the future when it might not. I also noticed that I think we can also make to some extent the same argument about Japan's policies towards Korea and Russia too, that in some respects they also seem to be becoming more hardline than in the past. And the second point is, I think your point about the Chinese and Japanese coast guards controlling conflict in the Senkaku Islands is a really good one. But what about non-state actors? I mean, of course, the fishing boat incident was really the result of a fishing captain. We've had last year Japanese rightist ships going through the territorial waters of the Senkakus, being chased by the Chinese Coast Guard and the Japanese Coast Guard in between them. And we might have, you know, we to some extent have and may have in the future Chinese nationalist groups doing the same thing. So when that happens, are the two sides really have good procedures to deal with those non-state actors when they do something unpredictable?
To your first point, Professor Midford, I'm sorry I missed your talk. One of the reasons you're my favorite Japan scholar is that you put it all on more eloquently than I do. And you use words like socialized, which I think, you know, confronting China at sea is not necessarily being socialized by China. That's just, I want to say good government, but that's what you have to do, and that's not unique to China, right? If you have a maritime dispute, you act like you own the place. That's not a Chinese thing. That's what you do. In some countries actually try to extend their jurisdiction even beyond their EEZ, like mine. So I wouldn't say it's being socialized by China, but it is being socialized into a conduct about maritime space and how you prosecute a maritime territorial dispute. But I don't think it's being socialized by China, but it is being socialized by a set of behaviors that are stronger and that China has done actually pretty well. And there's no doubt, I think, that somewhere buried deep in the Japanese policymaking apparatus, they were like, we should do this because China is. To your second point, I mentioned at the very beginning, one of the cases of cooperation was this agreement to ignore national staff in '96. And it's interesting because it kind of comes and goes now. It's pretty fragile, and China is ultimately the one that has the most control because China's not a democracy. Right? So China has prevented, and still does prevent, the Hong Kong-based National Security Action Committee from actually leaving Hong Kong from time to time by refusing a license for the captain and things like that. We saw the guy that flew over in a balloon and crashed. That was handled pretty well as well. So the non-state actors are the wild card, but it seems as long as they're not government non-state actors, and they're not sort of secondary government like Ishihara is, I'm cautiously optimistic that China and Japan can manage that, but they haven't always done a good job of it.
Okay.
We already have one.
Okay, yeah. So here first?
Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hey, my name is Tim Bedwell. I'm a student here at Temple University. I just had a question. I was looking through your argument about, you know, this sort of a trend towards sort of flimsy agreements and continued cooperation. However, my question is that most of the examples you give of these instances of agreements or cooperations have failed and are dead.
Depressing, isn't it?
Right, and so the question I have is it really a matter of China wanting to cooperate, or is it a matter of China biding its time while it builds up its military capabilities and asserts itself as a regional hegemon?
There is something to the biding time argument. At the end of the day, that suggests, because one of the reasons that China has been so successful in the last 18 months or 2 years or so has been a function of its capability. Right? The Scarborough Shoal incident, where China outlasted the Philippines Coast Guard, was purely a function of capability. Right? Chinese ships are better in a typhoon than Philippine ships are. And the fact that the Chinese Coast Guard is even capable of being near the Senkakus now, as often as they are, is a function of its maritime rights. It couldn't do that 2 years ago. Right? The very fact that its navy is becoming more present around Japan is a function of its rise. Having said that, I don't buy the argument that you hear all the time from Chinese nationalists that there's going to be a day of reckoning in the China-Japan relationship. I just don't buy it. This is an escalation that gets ugly very quickly, as long as the United States is involved. And China knows that. China knows that, and it's important that American policymakers be sure that China continues to know that. By deterrence and statements that don't involve Japan, it's a fine line. So I just don't buy the argument that failure of what I'm talking about leads to war. These agreements fail, and they kind of get renewed, and you see this pattern of conflict avoidance. It's not even dispute management, it's just conflict avoidance.
One question here.
All right. So my question is related to your conclusion. I would like to know why you suggest that Japan would accept the trade-off you outlined and thereby provide a de facto recognition of Chinese claims, because Japan enjoys the support of the United States and for the time being at least is in a stronger military position. If I understood well, your answer was that until now there has been a pattern of cooperation following conflict. However, is this flimsy type of cooperation necessarily leading to a more formalized solution, as you argue? Because my opinion rather would be that cooperation remains firmly exactly because a codified solution is politically expensive and the military conflict is economically expensive. So the two parties would maintain this kind of flimsy cooperation simply until the balance of power tilts more obviously to one side. So why do you suggest that this trade-off is something that Japan would accept?
Japan would accept the trade-off because Japan will have to live with a strong China that drives its ships around Japan all the time. Japan is also not going to get that much weaker. It's not going to get weaker than it is now. Perhaps I'm misstating the Japanese demographics, but Japan 20 years from now is not Malaysia right now. It's still a first world country, and will still have a pretext to have a navy and coast guard. It'll still be interested in gas hydrates on the seafloor. It'll still be interested in exercising maritime jurisdiction, and it may or may not still be politically popular to not let China push them around. So Japan will accept the kinds of protocols I'm talking about because it knows it can't beat China in a one-on-one. Right? And the United States only comes in if, in fact, there's a shooting war. Right? So Japan accepts this because it makes things safe.
Hi, Greg Noble of the University of Tokyo. I wanted to thank you for your Greg Noble of the University of Tokyo. Thanks for the talk. I especially appreciate your distinction of the interest of two sides when it comes to resources, a distinction not often made. You mentioned geography, which people often geology, I should say, which people often kind of skate over. Very helpful. I wanted to follow up on the last two of the last questions and bring up a hypothesis that you hear from more hot-headed types on both sides, which is a kind of death by 1,000 cuts argument. That as Chinese capabilities increase and as the PLA, for whatever reason, seems to exert a real influence in Chinese politics these days, what they'll do is try to keep a constant pressure on Japan, and Japan will have a hard time matching, and that they could use layers and layers of different kinds of ships, some of them non-state actors, as Paul suggests, and that the Americans would have a hard time coming in without creating a god-awful mess, and that the Japanese would have a very hard time carefully beating off this constant stream of thousands of boats. That's an exaggerated view, perhaps, but you hear it a lot. I was curious to hear your reaction.
Yeah, you do hear that a lot, and I guess my thinking on that is that at some point in those 1,000 cuts, there's a tipping point, because at some point, in order for the Chinese to get what I gather they're after in that scenario, someone's got to land on the islands, whether it's a citizen or a government government person. So far, they've treated citizens and government differently. Citizens are not actions of state, so they get treated leniently. We've seen no, aside from the Rayarlock incident and the sort of the buzzing that I mentioned, we've actually seen pretty disciplined interaction between state vessels in the territorial sea. So at some point, there will be, in order for that to work, China is going to have to at some point either land on the islands with a state actor to achieve its ends. It will have to create a situation in which it can land on the islands and then prevent Japanese intervention by virtue of overhead costs, kind of like the Taiwan Strait scenario, as it currently stands, right? But at that point, that's a tipping point at which America becomes involved, because Japan's just been invaded. Right? So either America becomes involved, and I'm totally wrong. If it doesn't become involved, I'm totally wrong. But if it doesn't become involved, that's a tipping point at which both sides, China would presumably recognize it can't cross. Right? So I'm not saying that's impossible and it's not going to happen. I'm just saying at some point in the 1,000 cuts, there's a point at which it becomes clear that what their objective is to invade the Senkaku Islands. Whether it's with one government guy in a canoe or a whole army, it doesn't matter politically. It's the same thing, right? Perhaps I'm giving too much credit to Japanese and Americans, but at some point in those 1,000 cuts, there's a cut that actually changes status quo, and it amounts to an invasion of Japan, as it's defined. And the invasion of Japan is a well-defined concept in all the literature and all the event stuff. Like I said, it has to be. Does that make sense? You look unconvinced.
Not entirely.
Did you have yeah?
Thank you for your talks. My name is John Bear. I'm from Korean Embassy. I have two questions. Japan and China are both part of the UN Convention on the North Sea, which can be useful in controlling their respective behavior. But many of the articles are not directly applicable because those two countries still haven't agreed on the maritime boundary. And it would agree on the boundary, easy boundary. A lot of outstanding issues like marine scientific research, fisheries will be solved accordingly. And do you think it's still there is hope expected of a big deal, or is it simply impossible to draw a line while setting aside the territorial issue? And my second question is, the commonly held belief is that how Chunqiao, the resources agreement has broken down, is that after the deal, the Chinese public reacted very negatively to the idea. And that's why that actually prevented the Chinese government from going ahead. And this led to the sort of generalization that any deal about the oceans and resource allocation will be difficult under the strict supervision of domestic bodies. And that's, I think, a bit different from Europe, and how do you respond to that?
In the absence of, to your first question, in the absence of the politics about who the other country is, maritime delimitations is actually pretty straightforward most of the time, depending on on the geography. I mean, there are countries in the world that have maritime boundaries that are 1,000 times more complicated than the totally opposite coastlines of China and Japan. So you can divide that based on, you draw a line and adjust for the circumstances. China actually does pretty well in that situation, from my understanding, because it's a long coastline. It actually would do pretty well if we lived north in Senkaku Islands. Because of the politics, though, delimitation is impossible, for the reasons you mentioned in your second question. Delimiting the East China Sea is, in a legal sense, sort of less severe than actually settling the sovereignty of the sea. But we're not talking about a legal sense here. This is a question that's just really with politics. So I'm not optimistic about delimitation because of the politics. Maybe 10 years ago, when it wasn't, when the political relationship wasn't so negative, you could have had something about delimitation, because there was a while there where literacy on like EEZs and things just wasn't that commonplace, and nobody really understood what they were. And I remember you used to see this in the Japanese press, that we used to always get wrong where different ships were and what they would call the waters. Nowadays, it's much more aware in the public consciousness, and obviously for that reason, cooperation becomes a lot more difficult. The second question, yes, the Chinese people did react to the Chuncho. The reason, and that's why what I'm talking about here, cooperation almost has to be tacit. It has to be flimsy. It has to be informal. It has to be an understanding. Right? Deng Xiaoping's understanding that we would show the dispute wasn't written down. That's why it broke down already. Right? But this is a relationship, as I've said, that has actually gotten away on understandings in the past, and that's probably going to be the only way they're going to get by in the future, because the politics have become so negative. I wish I had better news. I would like it to be formal, but I just don't think it's politically feasible. At least until, and I think China is on the hook here, more so than Japan, to exercise leadership about the other country. I mean, Japan has done a lot to engage China after normalization, a great deal regarding ODA. They've sort of turned a blind eye to a wide variety of Chinese actions that were frankly offensive, nuclear tests and things like that. And the Chinese government hasn't given Japan a lot in return for that. So I think the onus is on China to exercise a bit of leadership and have a frank conversation about Japan as a country, right? Yeah.
Maybe freelance from Germany. You said the support from US for Japan is essential for Japan. I think there is now a talk that Japan wants to come on an equal level to the US. Perhaps to come in a position to the US has to follow the Japan. Perhaps, I guess perhaps maybe the wish of Prime Minister Abe. So what does this mean? This kind of balancing power between US and Japan, what does it mean for China, well, perhaps also China, US relations?
Notwithstanding what Mr. Abe has said to his electorate, I think most serious Japanese security analysts and people that advise Abe on security recognize that Japan's security is better served by the U.S. alliance, and Japan can be resurgent as a U.S. ally. I mean, one of the reasons, the whole idea of the kinds of changes Japan is talking about to its constitution, to the interpretation of the Constitution. I mean, a lot of that's pretty constructive stuff. I mean, I come from a country where we used to be pretty big on peacekeeping, and a lot of what Japan wants to do is, frankly, pretty helpful. There's a lot of very dangerous places in the world that need more countries that are willing to act. So a lot of what Japan wants to do, it can do within the confines of the U.S. alliance. So now Abe might frame that differently to his electorate because he's trying to tap into a sense of Japanese resurgence, and that's fine. But it doesn't change the reality. Unless Japan is prepared to make serious changes to its nuclear posture, to its offensive military capability, which in some ways is beyond Japan's technological capability, independent of the United States. I mean, what you don't hear often about in conversations with Japanese independence from the US, it's just how tied up the two military-industrial complexes are. It would be very difficult for Japan to pursue an autonomous military policy in terms of procurement without the US. At least that's my understanding. I'm not an expert on it.
John, just very quickly, we only have about 10 more minutes or so, so if you could just make the questions succinct, please.
Hi, I'm Sean Clancy. I'm an undergraduate student here at TJ. And if I understand the situation correctly, there are maybe a number of Chinese government agencies that operate vessels that might be in the speed area, whereas in the case of Japan, it's primarily the Coast Guard and the self-defense force. So as part of your argument is that there needs to be a sort of informal set of norms and rules to govern maritime engagements. Do you think the amount of Chinese agencies in the mix adds to that challenge, or do you think China has pretty solid control over all of them?
No, China doesn't have solid control over that. There was an article, it was in the South China Morning Post this morning, about how this new Hainan fishing rule, and some Chinese analyst was like, we can't enforce that. They just don't know. Those agencies still don't know which way it's up. Now, China is supposed to be amalgamating those, right? Over the last 5 years, they're going to amalgamate between the China Coast Guard, except for one, the Maritime Safety Agency. And that's too bad because the Japanese Coast Guard, the Maritime Safety Agency, is the only one, as far as I know, the Japanese Coast Guard has had actual cooperative interactions with. Which is too bad because the ones that it's facing every day off the coast of Senkaku is the other ones. So yeah, obviously the multitude of Coast Guards provides a challenge. That's why I talked about improving Chinese professionalism. I think there's a lot of scope actually in the region for deeper Coast Guard cooperation. And I've spoken to people in my country about Canada playing a role there because we actually have a pretty decent Coast Guard. And we do a lot of the same things East Asian countries do, which is police an enormous EEZ with very few resources. So yeah, there's no doubt that that's one of the hurdles. It's also though because of the incoherence, it's an opportunity for cooperation. It's an opportunity to multilateralize this in a way. Part of it, like not the whole thing, obviously, but it's an opportunity for other countries to contribute to what is basically an effort to diffuse this.
Yeah, James, Mark Staples, Lockheed Martin, thanks for the great pitch and a very thoughtful book on cooperation between America and Japan and China. My question is what about cooperation outside the Caribbean Senkaku? Do you think that might help Japan and China, particularly? They used to have support visits between JMSVF and the PLA, and they got canceled. But they are operating off of Somalia, chasing the pirates around. And also the Pacific Command is going to host, the impact the Chinese Navy for the first time. So my question is, do you think there's a lot of opportunities for this maritime cooperation between Japan and China outside of the Senkaku, other maritime areas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a good news story that China's going to RIMPAC. That's a good thing. And I say that out loud because there are a lot of people in the U.S. That don't think that, and they're wrong. Because you have to engage the Chinese. And yeah, Gulf Aden is one example. I mean, China has signed on to RECAP as well, as far as I know. So there's another opportunity. And another good one is the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, where both China and Japan operate. The U.S. government actually had really good ties with the Fisheries Law Enforcement Command through a shipwrighter program. So yeah, and there's a lot of international scope. You don't hear about that as much. I mean, for instance, every now and again you do hear about people getting shipwrecked, and both Coast Guards helping the shipwrecked person out. It doesn't make the news. It's not what gets syndicated over and over again, which is too bad because in the absence of those kinds of news stories, this looks like a poisonous relationship. But there's a lot more going on, a lot more practical stuff going on, both in the region and outside. I don't know how much cooperation is going on between the Japanese and the Chinese, specifically in the Gulf Aden. I know that the Canadians have done a few things with the Chinese, and that everyone's taken the opportunity because it's cheap, right? You're already there. And they're the Navy that everyone wants to talk to, wants to learn about, right? So yeah, there's lots of scope beyond East Asia.
Stefano Carrera, the Italian Economic Daily. Some time ago, a professor of this university suggested that it would be wise for Japan to give up over the claims Takeshima in order to focus on what really matters, with the Senkaku and northern territories. It's a theoretical question probably, but what do you think of this idea? would be wise for Japan at least to pull down on Takeshima in order to focus and even strengthen his position over Senkaku.
In the book, when I set up the trade-off, I start with Robert's article about, when I say Robert's wrong, it's too much to ask. Here's why. That's an interesting idea. I don't think the political relationship with Korea gets much better if you trade off Takeshima, frankly. And you know, there's a huge disparity, I think, in how much the general population in each country cares about Takeshima. Tokyo. I think the Koreans probably care about Tokyo a lot more than the Japanese does about Takeshima, unless they're in the Shimane prefecture. But at the same time, you know, these kinds of magnanimous political gestures don't always build you the kind of political capital you want, which is why I'm wary of sort of the grand bargain. So there's no guarantee that if Japan renounced its claim to Tokyo, that Korea would all of a sudden become a huge fan of Japan. Is that, at least without some kind of guarantee from the Koreans that there's going to be some kind of reciprocity on, easing up on the constant demonization of Japan and other things, right? So it's a nice idea, but you really want to be clear as to how that's going to go forward and what you're going to get in return. And also, the Koreans can't promise, the Korean government can't promise anything, right? It can't promise that its people are going to change their attitude towards Japan, right? Because of course, their people are independent.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Kana Yoshitomi, Brown Self-Defense Force. And my question is very simple. Do you think China want to build order in East China Sea? I suppose China want to build order in Pacific with United States because China now realize China is a superpower and to build the new relation with United States. So building order in East China Sea is necessary for China, I believe. So how do you comment?
I think that's very perceptive. I think perhaps if I were looking at this as a Japanese naval officer, I am proposing in here that Japan is going to have to tolerate a great deal, and it's going to have to decide that some things aren't provocative anymore. It's going to have, under my model, Japan has to tolerate Chinese Coast Guard vessels in its territorial sea, which I've been told that Japan won't tolerate, but it's been tolerating it for 18 months without conflict. So that's what I mean by order. Order isn't peace. Order is getting along. Right? As to whether or not China wants to build an order with the U.S. in the Pacific, I mean, the Pacific is less of a problem because the Pacific is high seas, right? And the U.S. will retain an overwhelming superiority relative to China for operating in the Pacific for quite some time. And the Pacific is also not just a China-Japan, a China-U.S. lake, right? It's the world's lake. So order in the Pacific is very distinct from order in the East China Sea. But certainly, as I said, Japan, in my estimation, will remain strong. It won't rise the way China's rising because Japan's in some ways has done it. Japan has achieved the development model, right? So there's very little room to grow, but Japan will remain strong. And if you're China and you have aspirations to project power into the Pacific, you don't need a strong country at your rear that is unhappy, right? Similarly, I suppose in some ways it's similar to Mexico and the United States, right? And a few years ago, Mexico was a very, very dangerous place. It was on the verge of a drug war. And something that I got concerned about was if Mexico starts to come apart, that actually affects American hegemony in a big way. Part of what allows America to be a superpower is that one neighbor is Canada and the other neighbor is Mexico, and they all get along and they're both stable. If Mexico becomes unstable, that very much changes the U.S. ability to project power. If the Japan-China relationship is unsettled 50 years from now, that affects China's ability to be a global maritime power.
Okay, I think we might wrap it up here. I want to thank James. I encourage you all, this is all from James's book. So I'd like to take a chance to promote his book, Georgetown Press, right? When is it coming out?
April.
April, okay, so please, your university libraries for your private collection, consider
You can pre-order now.
you can pre-order it now. Okay, so I'd like to thank James, I'd like to thank our wonderful audience.